Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists again. They did. They got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host. And I am absolutely, excitingly delighted to be with you today. It is interesting of this past week of all that has occurred. But, I say, and I've said before, it wasn't unexpected in my mind in so many different ways as we take a look at our history. And that's what I've tried to do, is bring that to you so that you could look at history and understand what are those parallels for today. So, as what was that, I guess, before some kind of sports event or something like that, they'd always yell out, "Are you ready to rumble?" Really? Really? I mean, when we look at Wednesday, are you ready for a revolution? As my grandson would say, really? Nah. No, you're not. And as we've seen over the course of the several days since Wednesday, is that it appears, again, until we see, the real outcomes of the arrest, and if we can find any semblance of truth from those that may report truth, if they ever get around to it, we'll probably see that those that were there rushing in, except for a few that went along with the flow, as you're always going to get, those that go with the flow, is that the majority of those that attacked the Capitol were in fact Antifa or some other nefarious organization, be it some crazy neo-Nazi group or something, or Antifa, all of them getting together, and whatever other collusive activity was all a part of that. You know what? Go find that in some tinfoiled hat site, because that's not what we're going to talk about. It's enough to mention that we know that the Trump supporters, for the majority, are peace-loving patriots that would not do something like that to embarrass our president. Okay? And if you out there, which I don't think so, on Liberty Works Radio Network or at Soaring Eagle or at whomever else rebroadcasts this, or whomever else is taking and listening to this as a podcast, I would hope that you do not have the spirit of revolution, because I'm sorry, that's not what God gives. Now, in the promo and in here, I'm going to mention, I'll have a link at the end of the video even. I may do a little cut in from those other videos. Not in the program side, because I only have 45 minutes here on Liberty Works Radio Network, but I may do it what goes up on YouTube or on my site in the podcast. You really need to go listen to a sermon by Doug Wilson, the State of the Church, State of the State type thing. His sermon there on the 3rd of January. And then what he blogged on Wednesday morning. I think that was a very good one as well. Now, as usual, it's always after the fact, not always, but often after the fact when we really dig into those. And trust me that you may think when you listen to those sermons or podcasts that I was influenced in today's program by what I heard. Whereas I always like to say that because there is a God, there is a theme that he wants to get out to people. So with that, you're wondering, what in the world are you going to talk about, Tom? Well, I'm going to talk about, are you ready for a revolution? Well, you know from last week's program and the program before that, my simple answer is no. People, even patriots, except for a very, 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 very few, are ready for a revolution. And you go, well, Tom, yes, we are. Oh, yeah, you give me all that bravado. Hey, you know what? You couldn't even be manly. And those that are of the age category sufficient, going back to the 70s, that weren't deployed, like a number of us were deployed during the 70s and into the early 80s. You that were hunkered down in your homes, you had the opportunity to be politically involved from the 60s and the 70s and to the to the Tea Party movement. Everybody woke up. They went out there. Yeah, we're Tea Partying. What happened for the, let's see, 70 to 80, one decade, 80 to 90, 90 to 2000. What happened for 30 years? 30 years. And then all of a sudden it was like, yeah, man, let's go out there and take care of Obama and all that. Right. Yeah. And you couldn't, in that 30-year period of time, make sure that prayer stayed in school. That's a revolution. And you didn't counter revolution when prayer was stripped from school? Interesting. I'm ready for a revolution, Tom. You're not even ready for a reformation. You allowed sitting on the rooftops waiting for Jesus to come back as your primary theology since the 50s. Wait a minute. What's that got to do with a revolution? No. You see, as I mentioned in other programs, without the great awakenings that occurred, you can't have a revolution. And it was proven by the anarchist and a number of other people that I even heard on Tuesday that were striking up the emotions. And even some of the pastors that I love were black robe pastors, but we're supposed to be people of reason, especially if you're a Christian. You're supposed to be a person of reason, understanding, knowledge, wisdom that can be put to action. But Tom, Samuel Adams was the father of the American Revolution, and he made sure the revolution went forward. Boy, that's what we're going to talk about a lot for the rest of the program. But even before we do that, the sermon that I think is very key as far as the American Revolution, if you will, and I will be putting this sermon up as the number 2 sermon going up on the sermons of the founding and revolution. This sermon was, and that it's going to be an oration as well first, because I think the two go hand in hand. And it is called Stand Alarmed, O Ye Americans, an oration upon beauties of liberty or the essential rights of the Americans by Reverend John Allen. And he happened to be a Baptist preacher. It was the Second Baptist Church of Boston, the 3rd of December, 1772. In the dedication, he wrote a letter to the Honorable the Earl of Dartmouth. And so that's going to be produced for you, and it'll be up within the next few days as well. Hopefully it'll be up Saturday afternoon, maybe. The point of it is that what we have is that Reverend John Allen, in his commentary to the Earl of Dartmouth, he lays out some real hard questions. He lays out some of those things that would stimulate the mind of people to take and look at what is that understanding for revolution, but more so, what is it for the reformation of your very own heart? Because he challenges this Lord about liberties. He challenges him about if something was going to happen to him, what would he do? What would he scream? What would it be that he took on? But most importantly, he has this one thing in here I want to kind of say, and then we'll go on. He is talking to this Lord, and he goes, how your lordship can answer for the agency of injustice before God and man will be very difficult. However, if great men and good men and Christians can dare to do such things as these, and he's talking about all the injustices, all the tyranny, all of the things that have brought America to 1772. So he says, and Christians. So if great men and good men, so I'm thinking if great men, like all of the so-called Republicans out there and the Republican Party, and more so Christians and those that call themselves Christians can dare to do such things as these when in power, heaven grant that I may have no acquaintance with them in this world, or if they have any power in heaven, not in the world to come. For I think, my Lord, that such men who will take away the rights of any people are neither fit for heaven nor earth, either fit for the land or the dunghill. Now, I'll let you go figure that out because that's pretty strong language, from that period of time. And maybe in the second segment, I'll come back and touch on that. But what he's challenging here is this Earl in the idea that, wait a minute, if somebody's in power, when you're in power and you're supposed to be a good man, you're not supposed to be allowing the injustices to occur, which we've seen under the Republican Senate and when the Republicans even had both houses, what that was all about. So then he even challenges Christians. And he goes, how can you do these things? So what we're seeing, and I think the precursor to it from the political side that then pushed with the anarchist participation is the national frustration of great, good, and Christians seeing the sins of the nation, and nobody's done anything about it for the last 100 years. In fact, a lot of those great, good, and Christians have egged it along, have allowed it to happen. We've talked about that over and over on this program. They've allowed the evil to grab its roots because what? They didn't do what the founders said. Hey, Constitution's only good for what? A moral and virtuous people that needs moral and virtuous leaders. So the other thing that we'll get into in the next segment and the third segment as we talk about revolution and Sam Adams and what would he do as of Wednesday? Would he been the one busting through the doors of the halls of Congress or not? Yeah, the other thing that we have to look at is what is liberty? Because I'll tell you, I asked a friend earlier this week as we were talking about something in a meeting. I said, so what's liberty and what's freedom? And guess what? It's a difficult, in some people's minds, to separate them. And that what we're seeing now is that people equate them, make them relatively equal. Well, Sam Adams differentiated them very, very clearly, as well as did the founders. And that's something that we're going to brief on. We're not going to get into the detail when we come back in the next segments. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Yes, Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. They do, and they did, and it still resonates. They got it right. And we're primarily hosted here at Liberty Works Radio Network, and I am so happy to be a part of Liberty Works Radio Network and what it means to pursue liberty. But what does that mean? What's that differentiation between liberty and freedom? I'm going to keep asking the question because it's too deep of a topic to really cover today. So that'll be something that I either cover separately or, we do it in short snippets and maybe, kind of wrap it together for next week. I don't know. We'll see what next week brings. But here at Liberty Works Radio Network, it is a place for you to pursue those ideas on how to retain your liberty. So with that, you need to help the program retain what they do. So go find that donate button and please start the new year off. Give them a good push as far as getting some money in, what I always say, the ducats in the buckets. So help out with that at Liberty Works Radio Network. And my short way of getting there is lwrn.net. So with that, let's think about some of these things as we return back to the idea, are you ready for a revolution? Are you ready to rumble? No, not even close. So there is something here that, you need to go take another look at. I think I brought it up a few weeks ago, but even more so critical right now is what are the effects of isolation on the mind? What is that? There was interesting about what's going on with the social media. And when we look at now, we're seeing that President Trump is totally isolated out and off of social media, which that's okay. All the, the techno oligarchs out there, have thought that now they have their way. And so they're taking and going ahead and isolating. They're not even worried about masking. They're isolating. Well, for individuals, what does that mean? What's the effects on that? How does it work psychologically, so on and so forth? As we know, when you take in those that have gone through SEER training, it's all a part and parcel to how you take and make someone more malleable. That's it, malleable, malleable. So what was going on that Sam Adams is counted as the father of the American Revolution? Well, let's start out with the facts that he was an elected official. And what we have to always go back to is that little book and that whole idea of a simple doctrine that I bring up over and over, being that of the lesser magistrates. Well, Tom, those magistrates that, we elected and everything, they failed us there in the House on on Wednesday. They just blew it all up. They didn't listen to us. One thing my dad always would tell my mom is that the only representation that you have is the representative that you elected. All the others are accountable to those that elected them, and they may be from other states. So quite frankly, as terrible and as new as this might sound, you don't have a diddle drop of wet tear that any other representative in any other district, even in your own state, necessarily would listen to, because you didn't elect them. And for the most part, maybe those people didn't elect them either. What we're seeing from, the way the election process is now, and more importantly, where the big money comes from, because as we know at the federal level, it takes a lot of money. Something, it even takes money at the state level. I mean, there's some people just to get elected to the Republican Central Committee spent $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 to get elected there. Some people to get elected to a state representative position, it's like $30,000. Man, you can go buy a pretty decent car for $30,000, or add another 12, and there, back in my wish list that will never occur is that nice 3-wheeled Indian. Yeah, can you hear that baby purr? $40,000 for a motorcycle. Come on, baby, we can do that, but we'll get elected. Yeah, right. So right there, I mean, I'm making light of this because it's important to understand that taking and swelling the numbers to try and get the elected officials to listen to you when every one of those congresspersons in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Nevada, you know what, the people should recall them. And definitely when the next cycle comes up in 2 years is vote them out of office. But before they vote them out of office, they better be finding somebody that can replace them, because we've done terrible jobs of taking and raising up candidates. In fact, that goes back to what Sam Adams was all about relative to the revolution. Remember that Sam Adams, he first started getting involved when he was doing his master's, and that his master's thesis was particular, and I'm paraphrasing, was particular as to when is it the right to resist the government if it breaks down. I'm putting that into modern parlance for you. So, I mean, there he was. What was he? Let's see. He graduated from Harvard at 14. He did his master's degree right away. So here's this guy at 18 years old, and he has the savvy to be able to question whether the king and parliament have the authority to do what they're doing. Now, I have to say is that I have met over the course of this last year in particular some pretty savvy Z generation folks. That means those 16 to 20, 21, 22 years old. And I'm pretty impressed and delighted that they're engaging towards what they're calling conservative values. But once again, I have to insist that what is being missed in a conservative movement, in a patriot movement, and why nobody, except that very, 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 very few, are ready for a revolution, is because you haven't pulled off, by the grace of God, that Reformation. So once again, Sam Adams, first and foremost, was a Puritan Calvinist. Without question, he understood how God functions. He understood clearly what is liberty. Where does liberty come from? And we know throughout all of scriptures, everything there, philosophy put aside, is true liberty comes in through Jesus Christ and having liberty so that we could be what? A moral and virtuous people. Because if you don't have that personal liberty, and therefore you're not necessarily moral and you have no morality, I guess you could have some some virtue. There are those things that, the likes of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, even George Washington wrote about relative to virtue. But what does that really mean from a truly moralistic virtue that drives to liberty? So we're going to have to talk about that, as I already mentioned. But Sam Adams wasn't a rabble rouser. He wasn't one to breach anywhere. In fact, when he had Governor Hutchinson's knees shaking in respect to the idea of getting those regiments out of Boston, and literally it was said that Hutchinson was shaking, his knees were knocking. It wasn't because he broached anything. It was because he had the authority to come in and present and confront. And he had the support of 90% of the people. Well, okay, I'll take that back. He only had 66%, 2/3 of the people. I was off by a bit. But he had the majority. The Tories were something else. And he even had merchants, where the merchant class in modern days is jumping ship and bailing away from President Trump left and right. I always say, you know who the rats are when they start leaving the ship. Ah, ah, ah. So, interesting on that alone. Sam Adams did not facilitate a radical move. Sam Adams was writing about liberties and rights by what? By the time he was 18 years old, and then deeply in 1764. Yeah, 1764. So when we start thinking about Sam Adams and what it meant that he was the father of the American Revolution, it had nothing that the movies and some of the books about him and that portray as this drunkard, boisterous, crazy man running through the streets and rabble rousing. He was called a rabble rouser because the people would get so emotionally wrapped up that when he went to quell their insanities, when he went to quell their insanities, just like the media today. Oh, it's Trump's fault for everything that happened on the Capitol steps. We need to get rid of him. We need to do this. We need to do that. That news is not anything new. It's the same nonsense they pulled on our founding fathers, especially on Sam Adams. They called him a drunkard. They called him a rabble rouser. They called him all sorts of names. But you know what the people called him? They called him the stalwart of the people. They called him a champion. They called him the strength of what it would be to lead those in the thought processes of liberty so that people can act. But they did it under the fact that he was elected, and all the actions that occurred were that came together under that doctrine of the lesser magistrate. So we had a failure. We had a failure in that we have nobody really anymore except for those few with Ted Cruz and Mo Brooks and others that are men of morals and virtue. But we need to be cautious and we need to be ready, and we need to start with our reformation, which is personal, and then what's going on inside the churches. You see, Sam Adams knew that because he had some amazing preaching, as I talked about in the first segment on the sermon that I'm going to be reading for everybody to understand and hear that came from 1772. So if you're not hearing the Word of God, then you're not ready for Reformation. You're not ready for the Revolution. So come on back so I can help you understand that in the third segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they did. They got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host. I didn't know if I was doing that like a real broadcaster or something. I don't know. What's that mean, right? But hey, welcome back to all of you down there in Lima, Ohio at Soaring Eagle Radio. And on the 17th of January, I believe it is, we will be at Dr. Mike's church. We're going to an event on the 16th. And then coming up there to your neck of the woods there in Lima, and we are going to be honored to worship with all of you that are there. So I thought I'd just give you a heads up because that may be the Sunday you don't want to show up. Anyway, yeah, so welcome again to all my Screaming Eagle friends. I just love you guys down there and don't even know any of you except for Kathy and Mike, and my Kathy and I are just delighted to know them. They're just fabulous, fabulous people. So, are you ready to rumble? Are you ready for the revolution? Whoa, but the anarchists are. And they're prepared. And the Antifa are. And they're willing to infiltrate and drag people in with them because, come on, come along, we're going to, oh, really? So that goes to the same aspect of things, is that when you operate and you look for emotional leaders, you're going to get drugged down and out into the sewers of things. So as is well said and well noted and well reiterated by a friend of mine, who I would suggest that you listen to and pay attention to the two links to a sermon as well as a blog post that he did, is that Christians are supposed to be what I said, I think it was in the first segment, maybe it was the segment. We're supposed to be wise. We're supposed to be knowledgeable. We're supposed to have understanding. And we're supposed to have solutions. Those solutions begin with the knowledge and clear ability to articulate true liberty. And true liberty, as I already notified you of, only comes through Jesus Christ. So with that, you need to, encourage me to do the program or to do something about the difference between liberty and freedom. Where are they synonymous and where are they different? So we'll work on that one. In fact, I think that if I didn't do it, I will do it for next week. I'm going to put out a survey to all of those that are listeners, or I should say all of those that get the newsletter, to take and contribute and answer some questions, because there are some things that I'm looking at that I want to know what you want to hear as well. Not that I'm ever going to change the ultimate direction of what we're doing, but you know what? I do want your input, because we may bring a guest on or we may do some things that are interesting to you. But in that rumble, prior to that revolution, there was a time, let's see, what year was that? There was a time when, in the sentiments of America, that Boston being discontent, it came to a head in August, when it was resolved to hang in effigy, not politically correct at all, to hang in effigy Andrew Oliver, who had been appointed distributor of the stamps. So this was in 1765 during the Stamp Act. Wow. They were going to hang him in effigy. Stuff was going on there, and the people got all excited, And let's see what happened here. There was a population in the streets along the waterside quite capable of being carried to the extreme of ruthlessness and folly. Whoa. Are you hearing that? And in these 10 minutes, I'm kind of here's the connecting point on number one, America is not ready for revolution because they can't do reformation. It's a spiritual thing. That's what happened with the American Revolution, only came after the Great Awakening and was only carried forward into the early 1800s because the Great Awakening, the spiritual awakening and the changes in the churches occurred during that period of time. That's why I'm doing these sermons so that you clearly have that picture. That without reformation in the churches, reformation in your own life, you can't have revolution because it's got to be supported by God. So here you had along the waterside, what type of people live along the waterside? I don't know. We could put all sorts of pictures, but what we're saying here and what he's saying here in this history about Samuel Adams and the life of Samuel Adams is that they were quite capable of being carried, come on along, we're going to storm those Capitol steps, to the extreme of ruthlessness and folly. This wasn't January 6th, 2021. This was August 1765. Okay? Hutchinson most unjustly was made the special mark of their rage. You can substitute capital for the present. Gordon states, this is a historian, states that the cause in part was certain unpopular financial enterprises projected and carried through by him as far back as 1748. Whoa, wait a minute. Time out. So we have a Governor DeWine, and we have, we have all of these different senators, and we have a number of different congressmen that were in office for so long, and we could say that Hutchinson is the representative that kind of wraps it all together. So what you have is you have all of these people being the focus, if you will, of Hutchinson. So Gordon says that this was an unpopular financial enterprises projected and carried through by him in 1748. Quite a number of years of difference between 1765 and 1748. Since then, however, his standing with the townspeople had been as high as possible, and it must have been well known that he had opposed the Stamp Act as unjust and impolitical. So far, okay, so he was okay. He did bad deals, he made a lot of money. But at the same time, he was against the Stamp Act. Come on, give it up, folks. You got those politicians there in the halls of Congress that, they're willing to stand up for President Trump. So he was, a few signs, of course, he was obnoxious to the people. The mob, however, mad with rum, attacked with such fury the fine mansion of Hutchinson at the North End that he and his family escaped with difficulty. The house was completely gutted and then destroyed. And it goes through all these different things: handsome plates, furniture shattered, worst of all, manuscripts and other great documents of great importance that were collected by Hutchinson, they were gone. They were gone from history. They were scattered loose in the streets, and for the most part, they were lost. A lot of things happened, but Sam Adams said enough, called a town meeting the next day and condemned the excesses and pledged the aid of the people to preserve order henceforth. Sam Adams did that. We only have 5 minutes left. So when we look at the carryings on of a bunch of drunkards, well, how about Wednesday? Those were spirits, whether they were drunk or not. I heard or read someplace that, somebody was smoking pot in the Capitol after they got in there. So, that's another sign to me of Antifa, because, there are some libertarian patriots, I guess, but to do destructive things, to take and go in and do what happened, no different than the crowd of drunken hooligans that attacked Hutchinson's house and destroyed it, utterly destroyed it. But you have to understand clearly, where was Sam Adams in this? Where's Sam Adams in the revolution? You have to clearly understand is that the founding fathers in general, first off, understood biblical principles of governance. Sam Adams understood this from the history. There's so much that I talk about and could talk about of what they understood all the way back to the Cromwell Revolution in England. What did it mean to get Magna Carta? What did it mean to retain rights? What did it mean for a lot of different things? And then with that, act in that biblical truth, Reformation order of what is the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. And how do you take and through the magistrates hold accountable all of those? As we know, the state legislators were not able to turn or even get their legislators, their representatives in Congress, the federal Congress, to listen to them. So that's why I said in a segment before is that those people need to be recalled and or dismissed, voted out, whatever you want to call it, between now and then. But you need to be preparing somebody else to take their place so you don't get another dirtbag in there. And the states then need to act according to federalism. And they need to look really hard at their election processes, and they need to call their governors, their state auditors, their state secretaries of state to account. There's a lot more. But you see, in the end, as the program's coming to an end, you're not ready for revolution. You haven't even thought about reformation since the 60s in stopping those that would rip the heart out of our schools when it came to prayer, when it ripped out the ideas of being able to have free and open Bible studies in public schools, when it poured on the murderous atrocity of abortion. You've put a lot of money to it, and I put the link in there before, and I think I have it in the newsletter from Lonang, .org. In there is a whole thing on, why has the abortion folks failed? It's because, in fact, you really didn't want them to succeed. But you're willing to play games and throw money and to go through all of this stuff that, especially with the Republicans who do nothing, have done nothing, and will continue to do nothing. But you need to do something as an individual. All of those that, am I preaching to the choir and Liberty Works Radio Network? I hope you, and whoever else is listening on podcast or YouTube, what you have to do is pray to God for the reformation of your own life so you experience true liberty, and then you're able to exercise that into what it means to self-govern and then ensure that we have moral and virtuous leaders, people and leaders, to govern going forward. Yeah, it's going to take 100 years maybe to get back what we have. But without the Reformation, you'll never have a revolution. And thanks be to God that that is true. So come on back next week when Samuel Adams returns and those anti-federalists got it right.